Michelle Mazelleğ. Welcome back to my channel. I'm going to share with you all this video clip and then I'm going to come back and talk about it. So let's get into it.
And even before these discussions on reparations conclude, the entire continent of Africa deserves a formal apology from the European nations involved in the slave trade.
This is not the first time that reparations has been a topic. We know it's been a topic of discussion for a while. This is not the first time that the Ghanaian president has pretty much said, Europeans, you owe us money. You owe the African countries money. You owe the Caribbean countries money. Because of the transatlantic slave trade really did a number on the African people and the Caribbean people. It also did a number on the countries involved, that the transatlantic slave trade kind of affected. It did a number on us. And since that's the case, you owe us some money. You had cheap labor for a very long time. We want that money. I read a couple articles. I don't remember seeing any representation from African Americans. I know that they did say something about the African diasporans, but I think it's really important that the African Americans involve themselves in this whole global reparations with the African countries, with the Caribbean countries, because these large groups of people definitely need to be united in this front of trying to get global reparations. Unfortunately, there are some African Americans who want to separate themselves from the Africans, from the Caribbeans, and want to kind of focus on their own selves and their own things going on in the United States of America when it comes to reparations. And really, this should be the one thing that should definitely be a united front between, the Africans, the Caribbeans, the African diasporans. Everybody should be involved in this conversation because it has affected everybody who is connected to the African lineage. Now, there are some African Americans who have said, and I have kind of read in the comment section when I've seen the videos of the Ghanaian president saying, hey, we need these reparations. There are some African Americans that say, why in the world is the Ghanaian president asking for reparations when the empires of Africa are responsible for selling their people into the transatlantic slave trade? They collaborated with the Europeans, and they're partly to blame for the reason why, the Africans were enslaved to begin with. And so they have no right to be asking for reparations, considering that they were a part of the slave trade themselves. And this is what I have to say to that. The African civilizations had little to no contact with the European civilizations until the transatlantic slave trade happened. Little to no contact. It wasn't until the Europeans saw, actually it was the Portuguese, saw what was going on in the trans-Sahara slave trade that they got the idea, we can actually, we can use this. We can use this to our advantage. And so they went into these African empires. They talked to these rulers, talked to them really smoothly. Hey, we got this, we got that, we got guns. This will help you to be able to conquer your enemy very quickly. And what African ruler would not take that? Please tell me, what African ruler would not take that if you know that you're going to be able to continue your empire? Not many. I really don't know what people thought or think that the African empires were supposed to do in this situation when you have 6 nations, I think, 5 or 6 nations that are coming in wanting something from you. What are you supposed to do to fight those nations off? You had the Portuguese, you had the Netherlands, you had Britain, you had Denmark, you had all these major European nations, United States, these major nations coming to these empires for slaves. I think people need to understand, if there was fighting, would there have even been any type of African empires after all of it was said and done? Because there were some that did fight. There were some that did resist, especially when the Europeans started to ask for more than they initially were supposed to have. There was a lot of resistance, and a lot of those empires were toppled to the ground. Literally nothing, non-existent. Some of those empires that actually resisted. Now think if most of these empires would have resisted, would there have been any furtherment of Africa? How would they have changed the West African countries as we know it? How would that have changed if these empires weren't able to continue to expand and grow and create countries eventually? The Ghanaian president is asking for reparations for these African countries because it is because of the Europeans, for the reason why some of these African countries are not as developed as they should be. Now we can talk the conversation about corrupt leaders. That's a whole different conversation, right? That's a whole different conversation. But let's stay on the transatlantic slave trade for this time. The transatlantic slave trade definitely did have a negative effect on these countries that were involved in, these empires that were involved in the transatlantic slave trade. It negatively affected them to the point where they were not able to develop as much as they could have developed if it never would have happened. The Europeans left these empires with nothing. Even the ones that helped them in the slave trade, they left them with nothing as well. They took over them anyway. These empires were still colonized, separated during the Berlin Conference. I mean, the Europeans had their hands in Africa for a very long time. And it is because of their hands and because of them being greedy and because of them not thinking of these people as people, for the reason why the Ghanaian president is saying, yeah, you owe us something. You owe us something. You left us with absolutely nothing to even grow with. And some of these countries, when the Europeans left, they gave them their independence, but a lot of them took the money with them. They owned most of the banks. And they took that with them. They didn't even control that. So how are you going to actually create a developed country without money, without wealth? You can't. So the transatlantic slave trade did do a number on these countries in Africa as far as the early development of them. Yeah, it did a number on them. And they haven't recovered. They have not fully recovered. Now, when we start talking about reparations in the United States of America, then of course we're talking about kind of the same thing. It is because of the transatlantic slave trade, because of black people being enslaved, that then there's no way for them to get any type of generational wealth. There's no way for that to even happen, because when you were a slave, you weren't even able to own anything. For a very long time, black people couldn't own anything. They couldn't vote. So of course they're not able then to create generational wealth if they're not able to own things. So then by the time black people were able to own things, they were already years and years behind. So it's kind of difficult for you to catch up with everybody else if you haven't been able to own things for years and years and years. And let's not forget, when black people did own something in Black Wall Street, they totally demolished the place, burnt it to a crisp. There's nothing there. So then that generational wealth is even gone. So in the United States of America, black people, reparations, because of the gap. There's a gap there that black people have not been able to catch up to due to slavery. I mean, what I don't get is that everybody in this reparation conversation has a reason for the reparation. And what shouldn't be said, though, is when you have some African Americans saying that, well, Africa don't need reparations because they were involved in the slave trade. I mean, if we really want to get technical about it, there were also black people during during slave time in the United States of America, during the Civil Rights Movement, during all that happened, they were also helping the Europeans. I mean, we definitely, if we want to get technical, I mean, there's always someone who's collaborating with the enemy. That's everywhere you go. So does that mean that that person's family shouldn't get reparations if it comes to find that you know, that person's family was collaborating with the slave master on the plantation? He was one of the lookouts or whatever. He was the one that was on the plantation, that was the one supposed to keep everybody in order. I mean, is that family not going to get reparations? I mean, that's the type of question that you have to ask yourself when you start then pinpointing who can get reparations and who can't. Because then you have to start getting technical with it. Because we can find a lot of situations and a lot of examples where there's people that has collaborated with the enemy. And then you have to say to yourself, there's always a reason behind that. These people are still victims. Those African rulers were victims. Those people that was collaborating with those slave masters on the plantations, they were also victims. And we have to remember that. They didn't feel like they had a choice. They were looking out for themselves. They could have been looking out for their family. As far as the African rulers, they were looking out for their empires. I mean, there's a lot that we have to consider. There's not really a black and white when it comes to this whole reparations thing. So we can't start saying that somebody doesn't deserve it, because if that's the case, we can start looking up underneath some rugs, and then it might come to find out that nobody deserves reparations when you start really looking into it. I mean, if that's the technicality that we're going to try to throw out there, I mean, come on now. Reparations should be a conversation that all these groups of people need to be having, because the transatlantic slave trade did a number on all these people, on everybody that is from African lineage. It did a number on them. It did a number on them. It still is. So those African Americans that are saying that about the Ghanaian president that don't need to be asking for reparations, you just need to stop. Because the ones that are saying that don't even want to be connected to the African continent anyway. So what business is it of yours if they want to ask for reparation? It ain't coming out of your pocket. So what difference does it make? Why are you concerned? Why are you concerned if you don't want to be a part of the African continent anyway? Why are you concerned of the reparations that they're seeking, the reparations that the Caribbeans are seeking? You don't want to be associated with them, so you need to be worried about yourself and what kind of reparations that that need to be talked about on the American soil. Because again, there's a lot of perpetrators in every story. I think that reparations is definitely a conversation that needs to be had, because it's something that everybody that is an African lineage would definitely benefit from. And this is a conversation that we'll continue to have until something happens. Alright, you all, that is all I have to say on this topic. I am Michelle Mazelleغ. Thank you all for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.